Hello everyone! Welcome to the first video in my Live2D tutorial series. This is going to be the first in a series of tutorial videos going over how to make a basic VTuber model. So in this series, I'm going to be rigging one single model from beginning to end, and I'll show you every step along the way, trying not to skip over anything or leave anything out. So this won't be a super advanced or super fancy model, but it should be pretty good and pretty basic. It's a good introduction to everything that you need to make a working model that should look pretty good, like the one on the screen currently. So I'm not a super advanced or experienced rigger, so there might be a few things that are different from other riggers, or there might be a few things that I'm not aware of, or I don't know and I don't use. But as far as I know, everything that I do for my models and that I'll be doing in this tutorial should be fine. I just want to make a tutorial series because as far as I can tell, there aren't a lot of beginning to end tutorial series where you just stick with one model and see absolutely everything that goes into it. And I think that kind of tutorial is really, really helpful when you're trying to make a model for the very first time. And even if there are tutorials like that out there, there's nothing wrong with having another one. So this first video will sort of be an introduction to everything you need to know getting started with rigging. Before getting started with rigging, sorry. This will include things like how I cut and name my layers, and sort of an introduction to Live2D tools and processes that are important when making a model. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you in my drawing program of choice how exactly I have my model cut up and how everything looks. So right now she looks a little bit weird. Everything that will be relevant I have visible, so things like the shadow. Actually, I'm not sure if my cursor shows up. Does my cursor show up? I don't believe my cursor shows up on the screen, but everything like the shadow on her face and sort of different strange things that may look a bit odd right now are visible. They, like I said, will look a little bit strange, but I believe it's a good idea to have everything visible just in case, because I'm not sure when you import into Live2D, it might get rid of invisible layers. I'm not entirely sure of this. I feel like I've experienced both happening where it does and it doesn't, so I just try to be safe. So anything that I want to move separately from something else, I have be an entirely separate layer. So for example, everything of the hair, every single part of the hair is its own separate layer. I personally have every piece of hair that casts a shadow, so I have all of those be their own layer because the hair will be moving separately, so the shadows will also be moving separately. I'm going to, for a moment, make this shadow invisible so we can see a bit better. Things like, for example, the highlights in the eyes, I have be separate layers. Those are all separate in case I want them to move differently. Every part of the eye is separate, so I have the lashes be separate. I have the iris itself be separate. The sclera, the eyelid, all of that is an entirely separate layer. Some people will also have the lines be separate. For example, the face I have just as one layer, and things will look very strange when you get rid of layers. I find it quite entertaining, honestly, so you'll have a lot of this during the rigging process. But some people have the lines be separate. I personally don't do this because I don't find it necessary, but if you, say, want to have the lines change color for any reason, you would want to have your lines be a separate layer as well. So anything, like I said, that you want to move, have be separate. So I have certain things, though, are alright to be on the same layer if they aren't touching. So for example, I have these little wires. I have everything is on its own layer. Apologies if there was a cut there. I noticed an error and I fixed it. But basically, these I have be separate, but I don't have these two small things be separate. I'm not sure if, like, the top and the bottom pieces, I don't have those be separate. I'm not sure if I'm going to want them to move separately, but because they aren't really touching each other, so if I remove the hair, you can see that a bit clearer. Nothing there is actually touching each other, so you'll be able to sort of edit the mesh and move it separately of each other since they aren't touching. Hopefully that will make sense. It will make a little bit more sense when I actually go into meshes if you don't understand at the moment. So everything is cut. Most things I have clipped, a lot of things I have clipped. Some things such as the shadows I don't, because clipping in these kinds of programs and clipping Live2D work much differently. Clipping works much differently, so you can, but it won't transfer over. Anything that you have clipped in your drawing program will not transfer over into Live2D, and you'll just have to reclip it. I do it in certain places just to make sure everything is looking okay while I'm drawing. And your folders will also transfer over, and I would recommend to name everything, all of your layers and your folders, instead of using spaces, use underscores. Underscores make it much easier because the ID will then match the name. If you have everything being named something like, say if I had the hair shadows and it was named like this instead, it would then cause problems because I think it wouldn't necessarily cause issues or cause problems, but it would be a bit more frustrating because all of your IDs would then just be something like mesh 1, mesh 2, mesh 3, etc. This will make it so your IDs actually match the names, and it makes it a little bit easier when you have to mess with things like with IDs, such as clipping. Alright, so I believe I've explained everything here. I'm going to now import this into Live2D, and then we can get into explaining Live2D and how to set things up in Live2D. Alright, so as you can see, I've imported the model into Live2D. So I didn't show the actual process of it because I don't want to show my folders and such. But it is very simple. You literally just bring up File Explorer and you grab the file and you drop it into this gray area here, this working area, and it imports the model into Live2D just like this. So the first thing I'm going to do is, as you can see here, a lot of things are not clipped. I believe I mentioned this earlier, that things will not stay clipped, and there are some layers that don't have the correct blending modes. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and fix all of this. So in order to clip something, let's take this shadow for example, what you would do is you would put the ID of the item that you want to have it clipped to into this clipping ID area. So I want to have it clipped to the face. The ID for that is just face, which was one of the reasons I mentioned for naming things differently. As long as if you name things without using underscores and not spaces, it will keep the name in the ID, and that can make it very easy for things like clipping. You'll get notices like this every now and then. For the most part, I just ignore them. They don't seem to be relevant in terms of rigging, but if you want to, you can look over them and make sure nothing will be important for what you're doing. So I'm going to go in and do that. Another thing with clipping, with clipping, you can clip things to multiple layers, which is really neat, and I believe one of the reasons that clipping settings don't get transferred between files. So if you want to clip something to multiple layers, I'm going to use this shadow as an example. So I would like it to be clipped to every part of the leg and also this torso. So I'm going to go through and I will list all of the IDs of everything that I want it to be clipped to, separated by a comma. So that should be, let me double check the file name. Yep. And now it is clipped to everything. And it's a bit hard to see since the only thing you can really see on right now is the thigh, but if I move it, you'll be able to see that it's clipped to the calf as well as the foot and the torso. To put it back into place. So clipping is pretty simple. There's also something called an inverted mask with clipping. So I'll go ahead and just grab this sort of lighting effect here before I clip it, and I'll show you what an inverted mask is. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll use the wing as an example for this. Alright, so I'm going to take the ID for this, which is named with a 2 because the folder is the same. I might go through and fix that because it's a bit annoying. But I'm going to put the clipping ID in there. So it's clipped to the wing now. This isn't the intended effect, but it will show how an inverted mask works a little bit better. So invert mask, basically it will make it so the layer that you're clipping shows up on everything except for what you put in the clipping ID when you have inverted mask on. Basically it inverts what clipping does. Alright, so that should be everything with clipping. Oh, one more thing, blend modes. So, as you can see here, these shadows don't have the correct blend mode. They aren't set to multiply. I believe I had them set to multiply in Clip Studio Paint when I drew them, but it looks like that didn't get transferred over. It seems like sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. I'm not sure exactly why. There's a chance I didn't actually have them set to multiply and they were set to something else, and that's where the problem is coming from. But I am going to clip them to the face really quickly. There we go. And I will set them all to multiply. So to change the blend modes available in Live2D are normal, additive, and multiply. Additive, another warning that I will disregard. Additive makes things kind of glowy, it's more of a highlight, as you can see. Multiply, which is what I'll be using for this, makes things look like a shadow. It is pretty similar to the add and multiply layers in drawing programs. Alright, so now that I've shown you this, I'm going to go through very quickly and I'm going to clip everything for this model and fix any other blend mode layers that aren't set correctly. Alright, so I've gone through and I've clipped everything. I don't think I've missed anything, but a quick note that if you do miss something, it's very quick and easy just to change that later. Don't worry about it. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an art mesh for everything. So I'm just going to hit select all, and I'm going to automatically create an art mesh. So you probably will need to change some of these art meshes later on when you're working with things, but you don't need to worry about that at the moment. You can, when you get to those items, you can change their art mesh. I personally like to automatically generate a mesh for everything at the beginning, because if you don't generate an art mesh for something, it will cause problems. So I find it easiest just to make a mesh for everything at the beginning so I don't accidentally miss anything. And then if I find something later on that I need to edit, such as the eyes and the mouth are a big thing where that happens, where you're going to need to edit that mesh so it looks a little bit smoother when they move, you can just do that when you get to it. That is how I work, and I think that's how a lot of people probably work. So to automatically generate a mesh, there's this button up here that I clicked earlier, and it brings up this box. You select standard, deformation, or little or heavy. I just go with standard. Little or heavy deformation can be a little bit excessive for this. Standard works just fine for most items, and you just automatically have a mesh. And once you click away, all of those lines will go away. They won't stay there throughout the rigging process. That would be a little bit horrifying, but you can see them when you hover over things. Alright, so I'll really quickly, I will show you how to edit art mesh as well, so you're aware of how. So I'm going to click on this eyelash, because this will probably be something that I edit the mesh for later. I won't keep it edited here, I'll just use it to show you how. So there's a button up here next to the automatically generate art mesh. There's the edit mesh manually. You click on this, and then you can edit the mesh. So you can either select everything, you can do that to select everything and erase it, or there's an eraser button, you can just erase everything like that as well. And then you can use this tool and you can automatically create points just by clicking. There are a lot of different ways of creating meshes. It really just however works best for you. And then you can just sort of make little triangles. Triangles are the best when you're using art mesh. You want to try and use it as triangles. You'll notice in the automatic mesh generation that triangles is what Live2D defaults to, and that is the best thing to use. I am not exactly sure why. I'm sure there is a reason. I just know that triangles work best. Alright, so another way you could do it is if you wanted to, instead of going through and making each point and then making the triangles, you can just sort of make an outline. This is very messy. I would try and be as even and as clean as you possibly can when creating art meshes. I am just doing this as an example. And then you can auto-connect it if you're alright with the way the auto-connect works. and then say that you want there to be more divisions here, you want there to be more going on, you can hit the 4 division. You can keep hitting it and creating more divisions. Do not make this many divisions, you will never need this many divisions. So I'm going to go ahead and just exit out of this. And then yes, I would like to cancel. If you, for example, were to edit the mesh manually and not enclose everything in an art mesh, so I'm just gonna kind of grab half of it here and auto do that, it will cut anything that you don't include out of the art mesh. So I would recommend to be careful and make sure you don't accidentally do that. All right, so now that I have an art mesh for everything, I'm going to go over deformers. So you'll see over here there are 2 panels that show you all of the layers. The top one shows you all the folders and just sort of the order of everything. This is more for organization's sake than anything else. This down here will show you deformers and the deformer hierarchy. So for deformers, there are different kinds of deformers. So the most common type of deformer is a warp deformer. Any type of deformer is how you move something when you want it to move. So any movement that you're seeing my model make right now was made through a deformer. Or by editing the mesh manually, you can also edit an object or move an object manually for a movement, but it's recommended to use a lot of deformers. Deformers kind of keep things clean and keep things from getting too hairy when you get into multiple parameters. And I'll go over parameters and how deformers interact with those and why it's important to use deformers later on. But, so, I'm going to make a deformer just for everything and have a basic body deformer. So to create a warp deformer, there's this button up here. If you hover over it, it says create warp deformer. And I'm going to have this be a part of the root area. This part, the destination, just sort of decides what folder it goes into in this panel. So I'm just going to name it body. I don't believe I actually end up using my large deformer for much when I am rigging, but I make one for everything just in case. And for organization's purposes as well, so it's probably not necessary. I just prefer to do this. So, and this is also a good way for me to show you how deformers work. So this deformer is applied to every single item that I have. And another note with deformers, names for IDs, names for items, the ID will copy the name if it doesn't have a space in it. Warps, for some reason, at least I have found, don't do this. Regardless of what you name it, it will show up in ID as just warp 1, 2, 3, etc. So I'm going to change that. And you can see here, this is what a deformer does. It, well, deforms the art. It will deform the item, and it will deform the art mesh. So you can stretch and squash things, you can use these points to move things, you can use these smaller points to move things more precisely. These green ones are called the Bezier division, I believe is what it's called, and the conversion division are these smaller gray points. You don't need to necessarily know that, it's just good to know for over here you can change the number of them. Basically, the more precisely you would like to deform something, the more of either type of deformer you want. And you generally want to have less Bezier divisions than you do conversion divisions. And that is sort of how Live2D will automatically set it up. And as you get into rigging, you'll kind of find a best way to do this. And then up here, you can see an edit level. This will kind of change how it is that you're editing everything. It will change the deformer, how it looks. So the level 1, it gets rid of the Bezier divisions, and you just have the conversion divisions. Level 2 is sort of the default, and this is where it shows everything. Level 3, you have the conversion divisions, and then you have 4 Bezier division points in the corners. If you go back to 1, you don't have those. You simply have the conversion division corners. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to make some sort of proprietary deformers. You can set up your deformers in the beginning if you would like, or you can simply set them up as you go along and as you find a need for them. You'll sort of get a sense of what kind of deformers you need as you go, and like as you get more used to rigging, and you'll be able to set up more deformers in the beginning. I can show a hierarchy here on the screen from a previous model, and sort of you can get an idea of you're going to want a deformer for basically every movement or every parameter that you have, simply because it keeps things nice and clean, like I mentioned earlier. This can be a problem if you're using the free version, because free versions only support so many deformers. You can just use a limited number of deformers. It just gets a little bit more complicated and it gets a little bit more frustrating. I'll kind of try and go over how that works when I go over parameters. So I'm going to probably speed this up here, and I'm going to go through and make some deformers. So something I just noticed I forgot to explain was, I went over warp deformers. Before I get into making deformers, I forgot to mention rotational deformers. This is another way of editing things. So if I were to take, say, the legs here, because I will be using a rotation deformer for the legs, I will go ahead and create. So to create a rotation deformer, you have this up here. You can also create them just by dragging if you use this. Generally, I don't do this. I use this. The only time I've really seen people use this creation tool is when you do skinning. I will talk about skinning and when I talk about hair physics in a separate video. So again, this destination part just talks about which folder it's going to be in. I'm fine with it being in the folder for the right leg because it is a rotation deformer for the right leg. And then name it whatever you might like. It's a good idea to sort of name deformers for what movement you're planning to use them for. It makes things a little bit easier. There isn't a specific movement that I'm going to be using the rotation for, so it makes it a little bit easier just to name it like this. And then you can change where this is located. So if I were to leave this where it is right now, and I would rotate it, it rotates it based on the knee as the center point, which isn't how a leg works. So I'm going to make this invisible so you can see what I'm doing exactly. If I go back to my rotation deformer, which has disappeared, there it is. If I go back to my rotation deformer, if I hit Control and I click and drag, it turns blue and you can change where it is. Make sure you do this before you add it to any parameters because it will count as changing something and it will cause problems. And then I also will change that angle, but it isn't an extreme problem. You can leave it like this if you want and just use that as the rotation. I just find matching the angle with the actual angle of the object makes things kind of make sense a little bit easier, and it makes more sense in my brain, but whatever works for you is fine. So that should be everything. Rotational deformers do not have the conversion divisions like warp deformers do. They simply have an angle, since that is all that they do. And if you are going to be rotating anything, use a rotation deformer and not a warp deformer. So you'll see if I grab this warp deformer, there is an option to rotate it, but that causes problems and it does some weird things with the scaling of the object. So generally, if you're going to be rotating something, use a rotation deformer. It will look much better. That is what they're there for. All right, so now I will go through and I will make all of the proprietary deformers that I usually make when I first set up my model. I don't usually make all my deformers just because I don't know exactly what it is that I want to do with them yet. Alright, so I've created sort of some basic deformers for my model. I'm going to be adding much more throughout this tutorial series, but I just sort of like to make a few at the beginning to make things a little bit more organized in this panel right here and make things a little bit easier to find. And then I will create more specific ones as I go into specific movements and parameters. Speaking of parameters, I'm now going to explain parameters to you. So parameters are all shown right here, and if you look at the names, you can see that these correlate to certain movements that your model will make. So for example, angle X is the X of the head. Angle Y is the Y of the head, Z is the Z of the head. You have the IL open, IR open, and the smiling, the eyeball X and Y. Basically, everything that my model is currently doing is tied to a parameter and controlled by a parameter. So, parameters, sort of how you create one. So most parameters that you will need are already created for you. There will probably be a few that you'll want to create yourself, especially when it comes to physics or anything, things like tongue in and out, anything like expressions, anything that has to do, if you decide to use mouth X, that will need to be added as well. But most things such as the mouth open and close and the form, brows, body, X, Y, Z, breathing, are already created for you. So you are going to probably want to sort these into folders just so it is easier to find everything. And then later on, I will probably make another folder for hair physics. These are the default sort of parameters they give you for hair physics. I delete them, I don't use them. I make my own parameters for hair physics. So, speaking of creating parameters, to create a parameter, what you'll want to do is you'll hit this new parameter button here. You'll name it and give an ID. To whatever you'd like. Same thing goes, naming and ID rules, same applies as everything else. ID can't have spaces in it. The name can if you would like it to. And then you have sort of a range, minimum to maximum. So if you have something that sort of goes on and off, or something that has like a single state where it's like off or closed, etc., such as the eye blinking, the mouth open and close, a toggle for an expression, you'll probably want that to be 0 to 1. If you want something like, say, the head X, where it has a middle default point and then it has a point to either side, you're going to want to have a minimum of, say, -30 is a default it gives you. You can also have -1, 2, the same thing on the other side. I've never seen anyone use sort of like, say, a -30 and maximum of like 20, have an asymmetrical minimum maximum. I suppose you could. I'm not sure why you would, but more advanced riggers might see a reason for that. Having a higher number, I believe, just correlates to a smoother motion. So something like the head X, there's a lot of in-between points where I turn my head a lot, or I just turn my head a little bit. So that would be why you would want a lot of points there. Something like the eye open and close, just kind of, there's a squinting in between, but it's mostly just opening and closing when you blink, so it's just sort of a 0 to 1 sort of movement. I'm not going to actually create a parameter, so I'm not going to hit OK on that. So parameters and deformers, I mentioned this earlier. So if I want to, I'm going to just go ahead and show you this here with the face. I'm going to undo anything that I do here. This is just for example. This isn't something that you should be doing in yours. So let's say I tie it to here, and then I sort of, move it. Make sure you actually have the correct keyform selected. I move it there. So it's going to do that. It's going to, you can see it's sort of a little toggle and it changes where it is. This obviously isn't how the head would actually move, but this is just sort of a very extremely exaggerated version to show you how everything works. And then if you were to say add to angle Y, and I want to have angle Y, I want that to be, I want angle Y to go up and down. So you have up and down. Well, the problem now becomes, and this is part of the reason you want to use different deformers for different things, it doesn't apply in the corners. and if you kind of set it to that, it's going to, you'll see it doesn't do that. For certain things, you can do synthesizing corners. That is what you'll do for the head XY, in fact, because you do use the same parameters for angle X and Y, but you say wouldn't want to have just one deformer for the eyes and use it for absolutely everything for the eyes. For like, say you have one deformer for the iris and you want the iris to change a little bit when you blink, you wouldn't want to use that same deformer for moving the eyes left and right. It will cause a lot of problems, and you'll just have to go through and manually make sure everything matches up correctly, which is a pain. It's possible, but it's a pain. This is what I was saying earlier, where having the lower, you have the deformer limit, it's possible to use it, it's just really, really frustrating, and there's a lot more manual editing of deformers than you would have to otherwise. So if you can, try to avoid doing this. I'm going to undo everything that I just did because I don't want to keep any of that. All right, so that should fully explain parameters. Hello, this is EO slightly displaced from time. As I was going over my tutorial video, I realized I forgot to explain keyforms when I went over my parameters. So I kind of showed them to you unintentionally, so you probably saw them a little bit, but I didn't actually explain what they are or what they do. So keyforms are sort of the points. I mentioned this, the points where you will go like sort of, all right, let me just add some. So keyforms are going to be the points of the movement, the main points of the movement. So you'll have, say, for something like the angle X of the head, you'll have the middle movement, which is looking forward, and then one looking to the side, and then one looking to the other side. So you will select the object that you would like to add to the parameter, and then hit the Add Keyforms button. You can either add 3 keyforms or 2 keyforms. 2 keyforms will be most useful in something like the eye blinking or the mouth open and close, where it is just a 0 to 1 sort of parameter. But anything where you have a middle default and then 2 separate sides, you're probably going to want 2 keyforms. And then if you ever find yourself needing more keyforms than that, for example with the mouth form, you can add a keyform like that. And then if you have the keyform selected, you can also remove it. And then you can remove all keyforms for this object by hitting this button. You can see, you can edit keyforms manually using this. I never do. And then if you want to, you can select an object, and if you hit this button, you'll see every parameter that that object is applied to. So none of these deformers or objects have any parameters for them right now, but the head XY is assigned to the angle X currently, so it shows up here. Live2D will warn you, and it is generally recommended not to do this. If you say we're going to add it to more than 3 objects, or one object and more than 3 parameters, you can in fact add them to more than 1 or more than 3, I believe, but it is very much not recommended, because the more parameters you have one single thing assigned to, the more of a pain it is to try and make sure everything matches up correctly. So I would not recommend having them assigned to more than 3 unless you absolutely have to. This is part of why it's really nice to have more deformers for every single parameter, and it just makes things much cleaner, and it causes less problems. And that should be most everything that you need for Live2D. Oh, there is one more type of deformer that I should have mentioned earlier that I forgot to. I'm going to use the eye as an example of this. There is something called the Deform Path. You can click, and then you can sort of just drag these parts of the path and change the way it looks. This is very helpful for anything that is a line, such as the eyes or the mouth. That is where you will see them used most often. And like I said, very helpful, very simple. And so you can use, there's a lot of tools up here. If you hover over them, it should tell you how everything works. There's also the glue. I'm not going to be going over glue in this video because it's a little bit more complex. I will go over that in a separate video. So that should be everything that you need to know about Live2D before you start rigging. That should now give you a good introduction to how to set your model up so you can start rigging. You'll know how everything should be put. You'll know how everything should be organized and what the different tools and everything does. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful. I imagine it was a little bit boring if you actually know most of this and just don't know how to actually rig things yet, but the later videos will be going into how to actually rig each movement. I hope this was helpful, like I said, and I will see everyone in the next video. Thank you for watching. Bye!